Hello, I'm coming to you in another format today. While you hear this lecture, I will be in New York and then on my way to Pakistan, India, and Nepal. And in place of me here in your classroom with you is my husband, Dr. Khin Khin Jensen, an Augsburg graduate who's now a professor at the University of Minnesota. Welcome to all of you. I look forward to meeting each of you personally in a month. But while I'm gone, there are many things you need to do, many things I would like you to do during my absence. It doesn't mean that there will be no classes. It does mean that you are on your own a little more. There will be some things you need to do for me. My husband will require certain things of you, and therefore I hope you will work closely with him. This is, of course, a testing in order that you might be able to function through video with the professor and with another professor who also has a lot of teaching experience. With that, let me talk about modern China and point out a few guidelines as to what I'd like you to do. You notice that you have to purchase from the bookstore a textbook that is not very threatening, a textbook that's called China, Its History and Culture. I specifically chose this because there are a number of pictures, and particularly the cover of it portrays a very artistic picture of a horse. Now, the Chinese were doing this kind of thing thousands and thousands of years before the West had ever tackled it. And therefore, you will get a sense of history of China's past. Also, you have in the list before you in the syllabus a novel that you were required to purchase. And this novel is known as Spring Moon. The novel takes you back to traditional ways of doing things in China, male-female relationships. The book is by a Chinese-American woman who's married to a Caucasian, so that would be an intercultural marriage, just as my husband and I have. And she has written an excellent book, not only Spring Moon, but others before this. But Spring Moon happened to hit the bestseller list. Now, what I'd like you to do for me while I'm gone is to start right in on Spring Moon in order that you will be able to write a critique on it in about 3 weeks. Now, the book itself is quite a hefty novel, not thousands of pages, but nevertheless, it's not just 200 pages. Therefore, what I'd like you to do is to be sure that you get into your reading right away this week. Keep reading it, make notes of it. Who are the chief characters? What are their roles? What are you learning about the different things in Chinese society from the time when this story was set in ancient China, and what are the different characters as they move into the generations as we come into the People's Republic of China period? What are the young people doing who've grown into manhood, into adulthood? And as the People's Republic of China is established, what are the feelings about some of these young people towards socialism, communism? And therefore, you have a task ahead of you. Now, in addition, I'd like you to purchase from the bookstore a couple of maps. One which will be perhaps just China, perhaps Korea might be on it, and another which will be Asia. And what I'd like you to look for in addition is a map of the world, showing the size of China in it, and looking at the size of the United States within that same map. Because what we're going to do by the time I get back, and as you get way into the course, is that we're going to put the United States map onto the map of China. And we're going to see how large the country is compared to China, United States, and vice versa. And also what we might want to do is put Japan, cut out a map of Japan, same scale as China, and put Japan on the map of China. And you will find that also, although Japan is quite small, nevertheless, Japan has economically much more power, militarily before World War II, much more potential than China ever did. So that gives you an idea that sizes don't mean anything in terms of country, but what a country does with its raw materials, with people who are its power, with knowledge which people give, plus the advantage of location and the advantage of raw materials, and also the disadvantage of experiences that a country might face play a part in history. So what I hope I will do for you this term, if some of you have not had me as a history professor before, is that you might get a sense of history by seeing the connectiveness between Chinese history, Japanese history, which will be a part of this course, dealing with China, not entirely Japanese history, Korean history, which will deal with part of Chinese history, and then American history, which will deal with a part of Chinese history. And finally, all of us are very curious, what about this neighbor that China has close to her, and looking at the Soviet Union and its relationship with its neighbor, with whom today the friendship is slowly coming back again, but a little strained. So we have quite an agenda ahead of us this spring. I hope you will follow along with me today and also during the term, and try to put your best foot forward in trying to get deep into Chinese history and coming out perhaps one of the specialists on Augsburg campus. Now, what's the objective of this course? I've written a very brief objective, and summarizing it, I would like to share this with you. When you talk about modern China since 1950, you're not talking about a dynasty in China. You're talking about a group of people who are now socialist-oriented. They call themselves communists, but they're socialist-oriented. And the proper name that you might want to give them would be the People's Republic of China. The People's Republic of China has been tested since 1950. It's had its trauma. It has had what we in the West think some pitfalls, and we will be working about those particular periods as we come into the phase that we call the People's Republic of China history. But for the moment, as we begin the course, what we plan to do is to take you back a little bit in order to know China's roots and then to move you forward. Now here's a country today in the 1980s, this decade, in which we say that China has almost 1 billion people. Does that bother you? It should. Especially when you learn that out of that 1 billion people, there are several million each day learning English. Learning it through television, learning it in schools, learning it from each other. How many of us in the United States do it in terms of the same kind of numbers? I know a few of you might be in my class who are taking Chinese, who still plan to take Chinese, we hope. And I hope we have in this class not only history majors and international relations majors, but also business majors. Because if we look at the China market and the Japan market and the Korea market, out of those three markets, the one that many, many people who forecast business in Asia will tell you that the largest potential is China, but it's just beginning. Why then would we trade with a communist country? How can they do it? How are they bending a little bit like a bamboo in order to cope with modern capitalism? They're doing it in a special way. As we get into that period closer, we'll find that the People's Republic of China has specialized and sort of focused 5 or 6 special economic zones. And in those zones, which would be close to the coastline, and if you look at China's coastline, you'll find that she has quite a shallow continental coastline. You notice the lighter color on the map. That's shallow. And in that area, there's a lot of offshore oil also, a vast potential. And you can bet your life that Texaco, Exxon, and others are trying to drill there for oil and have permission. And who else besides the United States is also drilling for oil? Japan. Japan does not have the resources that China has. Japan has the technology that China might not have. And so it's a give and take. And if countries can learn to cooperate with each other, a lot can happen. And so the People's Republic of China, as I first indicated, has a new name since 1950. But as we begin the course, we will find that we don't call it always the People's Republic of China. We will need to call it by the different dynasties who ruled China during different hundreds of years. Because each dynasty sometimes may have 300 years, 400 years, 200 years of rule. The one that we might want to focus on more clearly would be the last dynasty, which lost the mandate to rule, being the Manchu Dynasty. M-A-N-C-H-U, spelled quite easily, Manchu. The Manchus were horsemen, and if you look at the map of China, you will find that they came from an area north of Peking. The area that is cold, almost like Minnesota in weather, and the area that has a lot of potential for natural resources. These were horsemen who slowly adopted and absorbed Chinese culture from a dynasty that had been ruling for about 200 to 300 years. This would be the Ming Dynasty, M-I-N-G. Chinese names are not that hard. People think it's hard, but it's not. And so from the Ming Dynasty, you have a group of people learning the culture, absorbing it, and later on coming through the Great War because of treachery of some Chinese commanders, and through the passes in the Great War, you have the horsemen from Manchuria coming in. Now, what's so important about the Manchus? A great deal, because this was a foreign dynasty coming into China to rule from about 1644, that's the middle of the 17th century, and completely running through all of China, absorbing not only China, the map you see on the wall, but also its surrounding neighbors, including the country where I was born, Burma, including, of course, some offshore islands, including Taiwan. Now, the history of Taiwan under the Manchus is a history that we need to watch very carefully, because although the Ming Dynasty owned the island of Taiwan, the Manchus did not try to take over that island for almost 60 to 70 years. You might say, is she telling me something? Yes, I am. I'm telling you that perhaps we need to watch a process that might possibly take place. A process whereby the People's Republic of China has allowed the former general Chiang Kai-shek, who ruled China from roughly 1928 to 1949, to permit his government, which is known as the Nationalist Republic of China, to rule this country of Taiwan, permit it to become very, very developed, allowing it to have a capitalist system different from the People's Republic of China. And you will find that this little island has the prestigious name of the Republic of China, ROC, those acronyms, whereas the mainland Chinese people call themselves by the acronym PRC. Now, what would I like you to do as a part of the team that you and I are going to be this term? We're first going to see the highs and the lows of the Manchu Dynasty. There were some highs. They expanded to a very great extent geographically, more than any other empire did in the last several thousand years. I think the only one that could sort of compare with it would be some other dynasties who ruled under Kublai Khan, the great Mongol ruler who also conquered China, and his successors were known in China during the Marco Polo period, and the ruler was Genghis Khan. Now, the highs and lows that I talked to you about would be the period when the Manchus were at their peak. And when I say at their peak, no one from the Western world dared to challenge Manchu China. No one could compare in splendor with what this court could produce in terms of glamour, in terms of products. The neighboring countries would bring what we would call gifts. And as they brought gifts to this very powerful Chinese empire, the big brother would give the vassal, the younger brothers, some gifts in return. We all do this at Christmas, don't we? We give some loved ones gifts, but if we're the older uncle or aunt, maybe we tend to give a little more expensive presents than perhaps the nephew or the niece can return to us. The same kind of parallel would work. And so as a neighboring younger brother, Korea, would bring gifts once a year, beautiful ceramic bowls, jars, vases, silks, China in return would give something that Korea may not have. So we have that kind of process going on with the Koreans, with the Taiwanese, with the Burmese, where I come from, and with the Indo-Chinese, the southern neighbor. Now, this republic of China that succeeded the Manchu Dynasty was a republic that lasted for only a few years. And this was in 1911, 1912. A challenge to this powerful Manchu kingdom, which ruled from about 1644 and finally collapsed, not because of Western powers challenging it, although we are going to talk about the story of Western powers. We're going to be talking really about its own people, the Chinese, looking at the power structure in the Manchu Dynasty and saying, is this power structure, which was all right in the 17th, all right in the 18th, and all right perhaps for the early 19th century, does it really work for the turn of the 20th century? And we'll find that the people who will challenge the Manchu Dynasty will be young Chinese men, a few women, who will have had some taste of Western learning, who would have studied about Western democracy, political theory, and then put into practice what they've learned a little bit about the technique of how revolution works, how do you topple governments, how do you try over and over and over again if one revolution doesn't work to keep it moving both within China and outside of China. And therefore you have a loyal group of followers under a man whom we know as Sun Yat-sen, S-U-N-Y-A-T-S-E-N. Dr. Sun Yat-sen, a medical doctor who did some of his training in Hawaii, some in Hong Kong, some in Canton, eventually, together with a large group of other supporters, including General Chiang Kai-shek, who at that time was not a general yet, brought about a movement in 1911 to finally topple the Manchu Dynasty. It was a process, as I said, an underground movement within which finances had to be a base, arms had to be a part of it, secret strategy had to be a part of it, and of course, in the long run, there had to be a loyal group of followers who would be willing to die for a cause, and many of them did. Now this revolution of 1911 toppled this powerful Manchu dynasty, something that the West never expected, I don't think, and yet the West cheered along. Once the revolution was in progress, we have China not turning back. And I say not turning back the clock because we do not ever have, since 1911 and 12, a dynasty in China again, in terms of a person being called Prince so-and-so, Princess so-and-so, wearing the crown, having long fingernails, having a courtyard of persons waiting on you hand and foot. That no longer occurs. You might say there is a dynasty perhaps. There was a dynasty when Mao Zedong was head of the PRC. Well, that's something we can discuss. But that's a different kind of a dynasty that is not wearing the glamour of the crown, but the dynasty that has the power of the gun. And therefore, that ruling authority stays in place. And this, of course, is the Communist Party. Now, as I share with you some of these thoughts early in the term, I think this overview might help you move and understand some of the specifics that we will come back and talk about as we study modern China. Some of you probably have an interest in what made China tick. What makes the Chinese people pull together? Is there something that they have that others don't have? Is there an ideology prior to the People's Republic of China that glued them together and made them stick closely to one another? Well, one could look back and examine Chinese history, and one would find that perhaps there is. One would find that for thousands and thousands of years, we have a man whom we call Confucius. He wasn't a god. He didn't consider himself a great person, but we would consider him a philosopher, a teacher, who became idolized by people in China who felt that he was telling them something that they had never heard of for a long time. But actually, he was pulling together things that were always there. He was merely putting together a structure. Now, what was this kind of structure that he would like to have? an ethical structure, a society that moved, where people knew their places, where the woman was put in place. What was her relationship to man? What was the relationship of man to the ruler, of man to man, of woman to man, of woman to child, of male to female? Now, in your textbooks, you might want to read the story about Confucius, because we don't always start understanding China when we say, just start from 1644 and learn about the Manchu Dynasty. You need to know what happened before the Manchu Dynasty in order that we could understand why the Manchu Dynasty adopted the Confucian ethics, the Confucian way of life, in which the woman's role was always subordinated, and also the subject's role was subordinated to the ruler. And so what I'd like to do now is to request that for this first week or two, you go back and read a little bit about the dynasties, about the religion that became a firm basis for relationships between Chinese people. Look very closely at the pictures in your textbook. Get into Spring Moon. You'll find that as it moves along, you can hardly put it down. I found myself doing that, taking it and putting it by my bedside. Perhaps you can do that, or carry it around with you. If you're riding a bus, waiting for a friend, pull it out and read it, and it will move along. With regard to readings other than the textbook and Spring Moon, you will find that I will be putting from time to time some resources for you to look at on reserve. Primarily because China is now being talked about very, very frequently, and as I put something before you on the camera, you'll find that there is a very recent issue of Time magazine, September 23rd, 1985, which talks about the second revolution in China. Would you take the dates down, September 23rd, 1985, and read about the man who has succeeded Mao Zedong in the People's Republic of China. He is Deng Xiaoping. His first name is spelled D-E-N-G. And the title of the article under the second reform reads, Deng's reforms are taking China on a courageous, if uncharted course. In other words, when I went to China in 1975, there were people who just wore very drab clothes most of the time. Women seldom had permanent waves. Very few had makeup unless you were an actress on the stage. Very few were wearing heels. Very few had television sets in their homes. But now, many of them are owning television sets. Of course, having a bicycle is a sign of prestige. But if you have a television set and a refrigerator, you are quite wealthy. In other words, this gentleman, who was a part of the team of Mao Zedong, except a younger man than Mao, has now come into the picture and is attempting to move China, which needed to develop economically. Socially, she had her ideology, but economically, moving this new China into the modern age. It will take a long time before she catches up, we think, to either Japan or the United States, or even South Korea for that matter. But she will. And who is the power behind that attempt to get there? It's people power. It's the ability to work hard. It's the ability to succeed, which is always there in the Chinese as it is in other nations, but with China, with a large number of them pulling together, you will find that you've taken a course that perhaps will be a very relevant course for you. And so that is my initial message for you today. I will be taping some other sessions, but perhaps from this first session you will get a taste of what it's like to be in a modern China course, dealing with the past, projecting into the future, and seeing how that projection will perhaps either fail, and seeing if whatever major you have, or whatever baggage you bring to the course, that's your major, you will take out a baggage that's richer. My second lecture on video would be, again, a continuing of sharing with you with some things that my husband will probably supplement as your professor for this month. Something that I'd like to bring to your attention. Some of you know it, if you've taken my History 104. Some of you may have picked it up from other history courses and reading. But what I really would like to talk about briefly is that the Manchu Dynasty faced a challenge from Western powers that no other dynasty in Chinese history ever had to face. You might say, what is that challenge? Where did it come from? Did it come overland, like the Mongols did? Did it come by air? It couldn't. It came by sea. And it came by sea from Europeans who charted a course along the Indian Ocean, came through the Straits of Malacca, some perhaps through the Sunda Straits in Indonesia, went through the South China Sea, and finally hit some of the ports along the China coast. But the Manchu Dynasty was so powerful at one time that it began to limit Western traders as the Westerners began to come in their large sailing ships to just one or two ports. In fact, at the opening of the 19th century and toward the latter part of the 18th century, the Manchu Dynasty had begun to attempt to close its doors that way at first. Fairly open, not completely open, but fairly open. I use that terminology primarily because it was open along the Central Asian plain, and you could get through certain passes. But to come by sea, it takes a little more courage, a little more adventuresome spirit, and you need to bring some goods that will last a long length of time. I'm talking about the Manchu Dynasty's experiment with an attempt to control the West, to control the traders from the West who wanted to trade with them, and to control them at a limited port, which would be the port of Canton, C-A-N-T-O-N. Many of you eat Cantonese food, that's Canton in China. And to control them in this city, and not only to control them within the city, but to keep them limited to a certain quarter of the city in order that the Chinese could keep track of what the Western traders were all about. Now you might say, why the suspicion? Was there anything that the Western traders were doing? Yes, there was. There was a suspicion that the Western traders were bringing in some kind of goods which the Chinese were not too interested in. And yet the Chinese had become addicted to this special article, which some of us might know is the drug called opium. Now, the Americans were guilty of trading in opium. The Portuguese were some of the earliest ones who were also guilty of this. The Spanish were guilty of it. And the British, of course, were involved deeply in it. Out of all the traders who traded with China during this time, in the late 18th century, the British, who had controlled India by now, thought that they would go further from India and also attempt to trade widely with China, because Chinese tea, Chinese porcelain, Chinese jade were items that were greatly in demand by some of the wealthy people in Europe. And therefore, if you could take tea, which is a pretty light item, and store in your ships lots and lots of tea, you could make a lot of money. China did not particularly produce spices, but the spices came from Indonesia. That's why we call Indonesia the Spice Islands. But the Dutch had got a hold of those islands. And you can see these islands right here on the map. Therefore, the British, who had already conquered parts of India by about 1830, now were anxious to test this limited trade with China that the Manchu Dynasty had permitted and see if they could go further. Well, the limited trade was to trade with just a few merchants, Chinese merchants. There were 13 of them, and they were known as the Kohong merchants. These Kohong merchants then would work together to bring together in large warehouses goods that the Western traders would want, and they limited, the Chinese government limited the Western traders to a certain segment in Canton along a very beautiful river called the Pearl River. And if you go to Canton today, you can see that. It's quite a historic place because there were literally several buildings, storing houses, we can call them, or buildings, where tea was stored, and as opium was brought in, opium was stored. Now, if you were in charge of the government of China, and if you had to deal with a problem which eventually got even as far as the royal court, you finally sat up and took some notice. But why the opium? Why would foreigners want to bring opium to China? Did the Chinese not have opium? And I think as you deal with this situation and read about it in your textbooks, you'll find that China did grow opium, but primarily for medical purposes. But what we have coming into China from the Middle East and from India, the Middle East opium was brought by the Americans. The Indian opium was brought by the British. This opium was really creating an addiction problem amongst the Chinese. And when you have an addiction problem which drains the silver, the currency in your country, and instead of silver coming in to replenish the coffers of the Manchu Dynasty, what you will have is silver going out of the country in order to import opium. Now, I'm not for a moment suggesting that only the West was guilty of the opium trade. In order for opium to get into Chinese hands, there were some guilty Chinese accomplices, and we must never forget that. And therefore, it takes two, the Chinese and the foreigners working together to develop this very flourishing opium traffic, which got so bad that finally the Manchu Dynasty sent an order and sent an officer and said, go, act, and get rid of the opium traffic. Now, these orders had been given before in the 18th century, but nothing had been done to implement it on a serious scale. But we have in the early 19th century a commissioner who took the Manchu emperor's orders seriously. His name was Lin, L-I-N. Very easy to remember, Commissioner Lin. Commissioner Lin hoped that by going and acting and showing particularly the largest importers into China of opium, that the foreigners would learn a lesson. And so one day, Commissioner Lin sent the order to the British representative who was trading in opium, and he said, "We want you to stop the opium trade." Well, these orders had come before, the British passed it off, so did the Americans. But the group that Commissioner Lin tackled head on, and perhaps he shouldn't have done this head-on collision with the British. Why not try the Americans? But he didn't. But he tried the British because they were the group that imported opium in the largest amount. And therefore, he ordered all the opium that was stored in the godowns, as we say, warehouses, to be brought, and publicly this opium was mixed with lime and then burnt. Ditches were dug, and the opium was put in the ditches, and it was destroyed. Now, if you were a British trader and saw your money go down the drain in those mud drains, how would you feel? I think it's important to put yourselves in the place of the British, to see the anger and the frustration, but to also see the point of view from the Chinese viewpoint. That they had already warned the British not to do this, and the warnings were not listened to. And therefore what you want to do is to see that if these warnings were not paid attention to, you teach them a lesson. We all tend to do that sometime in our lives, perhaps. We've taken care of perhaps dogs or little brothers and sisters or relatives, and if they do something wrong, they try to test you, and you say no, and they'll try to do it again, and you be a little more firm, except this is in a firmer situation. And so the analogy can be made that an attempt to develop this process through peaceful negotiation did not work, and therefore force was used. Now the British on their part, having conquered large portions of India by this time, and this is about 1839, the year, and there's some timelines that you might want to remember in this course. I don't ask you to remember too many dates, but there are some dates you need to remember. And so in this timeline of 1839, we have a very serious confrontation situation occurring. The British were determined to bring whatever manpower they could get from India, plus of course some British forces they had, and together with these forces, no other power challenged the Chinese, only the British. They began a war. And we call this war the First Opium War. And this First Opium War lasted for only 3 years. The 3 years was enough to show the Chinese that the British were much more powerful than them. The British were already not only threatening to take the central part of China, but threatening to move up to where the capital city was in Peking. And therefore what you have is a negotiation for peace, a negotiation to deal with the British, and of course the British asking for their pound of flesh, as Shakespeare would say. If you've been familiar with Merchant of Venice and the merchant Shylock, he wanted his pound of flesh. And so we have a confrontation situation ending in a defeat for the Chinese Manchu government. And out of that defeat coming for the first time to the Manchus, a foreigner asking not only for compensation, but also asking for land, for territory. And will the Chinese government give it? Yes, it will. Primarily because they thought that the territory they were giving away was something that was not that valuable at that time. But the British saw to it that that little territory became the most valuable piece of real estate in East Asia. And today the most valuable piece of real estate, which really is going to become the focus of the world's attention in the year 1997. The territory I'm referring to is Hong Kong. Hong Kong was a marshy little island. And from that marshy little island, what we have developing is one of the most flourishing free ports in the world, where you can go in and out, buy any amount of cameras you want, and you don't have to pay duty on them. You pay it if you come into the United States, but you don't pay any duty as you take it out of Hong Kong. You can buy any other kind of equipment, and today we're talking about Hong Kong being the gateway to go into the People's Republic of China and developing trade linkages, multinational linkages between Minnesota firms and Chinese firms back in China. So the story that I'm relating to you, which might refer to 1839 and 1842, by 1842, the treaty that ends the war is known as the Treaty of Nanking. And remember, we have a Nanking hotel, a Nanking restaurant in Minneapolis. Well, that Nanking was a city in China, and it's located on one of the largest rivers that China has, which cuts right in the center of China. And this river is known as the Yangtze River. I suppose you can compare it to the Mississippi River, except the Mississippi River tends to go north and south. The Yangtze River will go east and west. And at the mouth of the Yangtze River, you have two cities that you should become familiar with. One would be Nanking, further in, and right at the mouth would be Shanghai. Shanghai, that international port that was later requested by the Westerners from the Manchu government. But for the moment, for our purposes, one needs to understand that the first Opium War ended in tragedy for the Manchu government, ended in victory for the foreigners, the British who tackled the Chinese, and ended with benefits for all Europeans who wanted to trade in China, including the Americans. How do we move from there? And what do you want to pay attention to in Chinese history? Well, examine briefly this treaty, and you will find that nowhere in the treaty does it talk about outlawing the opium trade. In fact, the opium trade increased. The very fact that a piece of real estate called the island of Hong Kong was given to the British government meant that the Chinese lost forever the control of what the British could do with this island. The technicality was that Hong Kong was Chinese territory, but the British were going to have it for 99 years. Now, 99 years is a long time. And as you look at that period in 99 years, the British developed this island where people used to get malaria and get sick into one of the most healthy real estate territories in the whole of the South China Sea. And I would urge that many of you, as you plan your vacations, as you look at the Northwest Orient and the Republic Airlines special fairs, might want to visit Hong Kong sometime and relive your Chinese history that you're going to study this term. Since opium was not outlawed, you can bet your life that the opium trade increased, with the Chinese Manchu government having no power to control it. They attempted to, but they were not successful. So the first Opium War, or the first Anglo-Chinese War that the Manchu government had to tackle, was a failure. So here you have an attempt on the part of the Europeans to test the Chinese, and the response on the part of the Chinese to see if this testing could be really a challenge that the Westerners would have to say, they won't test it anymore. Instead, the Chinese proved to be quite weak. And so in a few years, 2 countries will test the Chinese Manchu government again. Again, the issue is opium. And this time, instead of only the British having to carry the banner of their flag against the Chinese, the French will join with the British and will have a second Opium War. And I would like to urge all of you to read some of the details of the Second Opium War. Why was it fought? Where was it fought? Was it fought only in the Canton area as the first Chinese war with the British was fought? How far did it extend? And you'll find that it did extend much further. If you look at a map of China, you have Hong Kong here, where my finger is, moving up along the coastline. Shanghai would be the area between the 2 poles. The war was of far greater scope in terms of attacks by either side to one another. When did it stop? When did it begin? Briefly, it began in 1856. It ended in 1858. 2 years. Even more brief than the first war, which was 3 years. And in this case, it ended much more quickly because of the attempted attack on the capital city of the Manchu government, which was Peking. If anyone wanted to attack Washington, D.C., we would be a little nervous. Therefore, can you place yourself in the persons of the Chinese decision makers and feel their fear as the British and the French would plan to attack Peking? Well, it didn't work. The peaceful attempts to settle this controversy, which came into a war in 1856, by 1858, although it was terminated, the Chinese did not seem to want to go through with the peace terms which were negotiated. And this time the Chinese were trying, perhaps, to pull a bluff. How far could they test the patience of the British and the French? And the British and the French, because they had won so easily in moving from Shanghai up to the coastline near Peking, were not about to be waiting too long. And in this waiting game of who would be much more powerful and which strategy would win, we have an interesting pattern of one trying to outdo the other in the game playing of war. And notice who will benefit. For those of you who are taking communist foreign policy, and Dr. Noonan does the China unit quite a bit because the Russians had a great deal to do with the Chinese during the 19th and early 20th centuries, we will find that it's not the communist government now who are watching closely what the French and the British are doing to the Chinese. It's the Tsarist government, the Romanov dynasty that's ruling Russia at this time, before the Bolshevik Revolution. The Romanov dynasty that had these great ambitions to cross the Ural Mountains to cross the Ural Mountains and stretch their empire to the Siberian coastline. And they were successful. But they did not have a warm water port. And therefore, in order to have a port where ships could come in all throughout the year, the Russians were scouting for an area that the Chinese owned. Some of you know perhaps the area I'm referring to. The area that has a very nice climate. It's called the Maritime Province today. The Chinese call it by a different name, but very similar to the climate we have in Washington State and in Portland. And the Russians picked out not only a real estate area on the hinterland of the port, but they had selected a port itself. The city and the port of Vladivostok. Learn how to spell that in this course, because you need to know how to spell it. Now, this port would be considered a warm water port. And the Russians needed that in order that their ships could come right up into the Sea of Japan from up north and slowly, with Japan's permission, move now into the East China Sea and into the Yellow Sea, and thus into the Pacific Ocean. Who owned that real estate prior to 1860? The Manchu government. So really the Manchu government was giving up a part of their homeland. And if you're a Manchurian, you can be quite uptight about that. But at this time, this maritime province had not been developed very well in terms of agriculture, in terms of transportation. And therefore, when the Russians asked for it, the Russians pretended they were posing as the friends of the Chinese against the British and the French, who were asking for a lot of demand. And here's the story very briefly. The British and the French were told by the Russians, don't push China too hard. The paper tiger can really get very ferocious. And then the Russians would in turn go to the Chinese and tell the Chinese, don't dilly-dally with the French and the British. You can push them so far and no more. Make up your mind as to what you want to do and sign a peace treaty to end the conflict, called the Second Opium War. Occasionally it's known as the Arrow War because of a ship that was involved, the ship Arrow. And so by 1860, we have the conclusion of a treaty, a convention signed called the Convention of Peking, but because the Chinese had prolonged this negotiation, the soldiers, both the French and the British, went on a rampage into the city of Peking and destroyed some of the greatest art treasures and buildings and precious stones that were embedded in some of the buildings. And also the most beautiful architectural design structures built on the model of the Italian designs by some Italian missionaries who had worked for the Ming Dynasty were destroyed forever. So war is a terrible thing, that it can destroy history. When you destroy buildings, they can never be replaced. You can only see them through pictures. And so I'd like to conclude with the Second Opium War. I would urge that you read the details of this treaty. I would like to urge that you also read some of the impact that this treaty has on the Chinese, on the French, on the British, and finally, the ramifications of being in the moderator role for the Russians, who ended up with one of the best real estate areas in this part of the world and not raising a finger in fighting during this Second Opium War. Today I'd like to do something else. As a third part of my sharing with you during my absence, I'd like to talk about the opening of China now. China is no longer limited in terms of foreigners being able to only reside at a certain location in a certain city. The foreigners in their treaty negotiations will ask for many, many cities, for many areas in which they can live and trade. And notice what else the foreigners will ask for. They will ask for the right of their missionaries. So now we have a new component being brought into Chinese-Western relations. The right of the missionary to move and live and convert wherever they want to, provided, of course, they have a legitimate passport, be it a British passport, an American passport, an Italian, or a British. I think it's very important that we learn the role of the church, the Christian church in China. The church did many wonderful things in terms of education, in terms of agricultural development, in terms of allowing women an equal chance with men in education. But there's also a negative side of the Christian church in China. Did it misuse its powers at certain times? You be the judge, because the story is still being written as to whether certain denominations misused the church. There's the other role. Did certain groups of Christians become misunderstood through their actions in trying to help the Chinese? As you read your novel, The Spring Moon, you'll find that the role of the female, particularly a female baby, is not as important as the role of a male child. And therefore, if you were in a peasant family, having too many girl babies, you sought to get rid of them, because it was very hard to earn a living in some of the villages in China, particularly if the landlord was demanding a great amount of taxes in the form of food grains produced. So what would you do? I think the important thing to remember is that the church tried to help those in need. Many of their converts came from the poor. The Italian missionaries tried to gain converts from the elite, the scholar gentry class. But the 19th and 20th century missionaries moved more amongst the middle class and the lower middle classes. And therefore, this awareness of what the missionaries were doing on the part of some mothers who couldn't afford to keep their babies would be this, that they would leave their little children, sometimes male, quite often female, in a basket outside the orphanages, outside a convent gate. Usually foreigners had a gate around their buildings to protect themselves from the Chinese. Get any image in what I'm saying? Why would you want to go to mission to others and yet barricade yourself with a wall? Is there going to be much contact? You answer the question. Well, outside the gates of many mission compounds, particularly Catholic nuns, you find that girl babies were left. And the parents would see to it and watch that the babies would be taken in. Some of the parents were very poor, but they still watched. And when the babies were taken in, they were found by the nuns who came outside either to go someplace or by the servants. The story went around after the Second Opium War that the nuns in these orphanages were taking the eyes out of the babies and experimenting with the babies, and some horror stories started to go around. And therefore, in the year 1870, through some misunderstanding, there began to be persecution of Christians, foreigners who happened to live in some of the far-off places outside the city limits. You have an event called the Khin Khin Massacre. And this really frightened the foreigners, and they began to be a little more careful as to where they went at night time. And also the foreigners had to explain that they really were not eating the eyes and cooking the eyes of the babies. The babies were being taken care of very well. But once you start a rumor, you and I both know that it's hard to stop it. And particularly it would be hard to stop amongst people who don't have much of an education, even their own classical education. Now you also might want to do this as you get into your reading. Understand that in the last quarter of the 19th century, this powerful Manchu dynasty will be tested even more. We're talking about it being tested in the decade of the 1830s, the Opium War. It's going to be tested even more in the last quarter century of the 19th century. And if you want to place your history, I love to do this, I would like you to imagine American history when the West was being settled and when we had already built our railroads and connected it up. And of course you need to remember, which is often forgotten, that who helped us connect up the railroads and dynamited the mountains in Colorado in order that we could build railroads hugging the mountainside? It was the Chinese immigrants, whom we eventually excluded in the year 1882, and finally, definitely, 1892. But that's another story. But in the last quarter of the 19th century, what we have is this, that the Manchu dynasty will realize that it can no longer continue the same process of government as it did in the past. It needed to change. There were too many Westerners wanting to trade with China. Americans were in the forefront of this. So what do you do in order that you can cope with the West coming in and wanting to be in China in larger numbers? Well, you roll with the punch. If the West is anxious to sell you arms, you buy the arms. If the West is willing to bring people to train you in the use of these arms, you employ them. And so the model of the West selling arms, the model of the West bringing new equipment for China's developing navy became a pattern. So China now moves into the stage of what we would call, quote-unquote, modernization. Now, in terms of modernization, we need to look at a neighbor of China, which is Japan. Japan had already modernized about 20 to 30 years ahead of the Chinese. And Japan was, like China, an isolated country. If you notice the size on the map, one is small, one is very large. And how could a small country like Japan develop and speed ahead of China? Well, Japan used the Western model of developmental stage, copying the Industrial Revolution that the West had. Japan brought technicians from the West and had them introduce it in Japan, and the Japanese learned from those Western technicians. Now the Chinese began to do this, but on a smaller scale and at a later period. very last quarter of the 19th century. Japan did it in the decades of the 1870s. So what you have is a comparative mode of two eastern countries, China, the larger, the giant, looking at the dwarf, the Japanese, and yet the dwarf trying to get ahead of the giant by leaps and bounds, and succeeding in that. Now let's look at the story of success of the Japanese and how it will impinge on Chinese history in the late 19th century. What we have happening in the decade of the 1880s is a testing by Japan on how much control China has over a piece of real estate which we call today Korea. Now the Koreans are very proud people. They have an ancient history, a rich history. They developed printing long before the Gutenberg Bible was printed. They were the bridge that took Buddhism and Confucianism from China to Japan. And they were the bridge in a number of other things, such as the development of ceramics, the printing and the weaving of beautiful silk material in Japan. The technique was taken from China via Korea to Japan. So let's pause for a moment and look at Korea. I don't plan to deal with it in depth at this point, but merely point out that Korea had a special relationship with China. And this special relationship was this, that each year Korea would send to Peking a large contingent of people bearing gifts, and China in turn would give some gifts, but also protect Korea from any attack by outsiders. Now, no one had tested this promise before. The country that will test this relationship in the 1880s and really strike a blow at it in the decade of the 1890s will be Japan. Japan decided in 1882 to really ask China what her relationship was with Korea. China, of course, tried to pass the buck. Japan was in no mood for China passing the buck, to use today's terminology. And so what we have is that there is a straining of relationship in the 1880s, which will turn into a powerful conflict in a war which will last only 1 year. But in that 1 year, all those countries who are trading in China will be onlookers, looking on at a conflict between the dwarf and the giant, two Asian powers who had never gone to war with each other, now fighting over a piece of real estate, Korea. This is known as the First Sino-Japanese War. The First Sino-Japanese War, of course, was really a surprise for Westerners because Japan was using Western technology in the war. Knowing that China had a navy, the Japanese brought their navy into a little tip of Chinese territory in Manchuria, known as the Liaotang Peninsula. Also, China had her ships along the coastline of Korea, and the Japanese merely moved right in, were able to destroy the Chinese ships, practically wipe out the brand new Chinese navy, and the Chinese commander of those ships committed suicide with his wife. Now this is customary in China when a person has lost faith. It's not done all the time, but when a commander feels that it is his fault This is quite often done. And the Japanese might tend to do it too. You give up your life because you felt you have been in the wrong in not protecting your country enough. The onlookers to this conflict, the Sino-Japanese War, the first one, the onlookers were, you might want to guess at them as I list them for you. The British, the French, the Russians, the Germans. All nervous, sitting with their hands tied behind their back because they were not going to get involved, but also hoping whoever they were pulling for would give them a break. Well, to their surprise, instead of China winning, Japan won. And therefore, when Japan imposed a very hefty and sort of a heavy indemnity on China, 3 countries moved in and told Japan, lay off. You've asked more than enough. If you asked for more territory on Chinese soil, we will challenge you. So what I'd like to do now is to just indicate for you where you look for this information. The treaty is known as the Treaty of Shimonoseki. This is a place in Japan. And the treaty indicated how much money Japan wanted from China, what kind of privileges that Japan would get in Korea, and the role that China no longer should play in Korea. So I've set a task for you. I hope I've tantalized you enough in looking at the international relations and the diplomatic intrigue that goes on in this northeastern triangle of the area we call Northeast Asia, and find out that not only are the Russians interested in this area, not only are the Japanese interested in moving into Korea, but there are 2 new countries, the Germans and the French, who would like to have a piece of the pie. The Germans are not particularly interested in Korea at this time, but they have a secret agenda. They have a piece of real estate that they would like to move into, and they will take this up. And the piece of real estate that the French are interested in is to look further down at the map that I have before you, Indochina. And for those of you who are not familiar with where Vietnam is by now and where Indochina is, you will be doing that on your math assignments, so be sure you know where to look for Indochina the moment it's mentioned, perhaps in the lectures. For the Germans, by this time, they are moving in large numbers into the Pacific Ocean, taking islands just north of Australia, near a piece of territory which we consider the largest island in the Pacific Ocean. That's New Guinea. And if you belong to the American Lutheran Church, there's a lot of missionaries from the Lutheran Church who go out to serve in Papua New Guinea. Well, that was all German territory at the close of the 19th century. But the Germans were interested in a piece of real estate in China also. And if I had to point it out on the map, it would be right here, a kind of a little beak jutting out, and we call this the Shantung Peninsula. And so in closing, I'd like to point this piece of territory out, take a good look at it, place it in a larger perspective of the Pacific Ocean. The Shantung Peninsula has some of the largest and best deep sea ports, and the German Navy could come in there very easily, and that was Germany's secret agenda, to get that piece of real estate, which she will get by the close of the 19th century. And so I would urge you to read about the late 19th century conflict, and the efforts that the Manchu government had to hold on to challenges from Japan and from a few other countries. And into this challenge, you have a kind of a mixed up piece of information which is being sorted out today, the role of the Christian church in China. Now the next piece of information, and I'd like to have this be used at another session in my class, would be the period in Chinese history where one would say that China really fell with a deep, deep bump. She bumped herself hard as she had never bumped herself before. We think of Humpty Dumpty falling over the wall. All of us grow up with stories if you have been read to as a child. Now, what was China's problem? As we look at China, we need to be aware of this, that by the late 19th century, China felt that she had been pushed and pushed till she could no longer take it any longer. And therefore, she will rise up and show that she had a little bit of strength left in order to challenge any kind of request that came either from Japan or from the Western powers or from the missionaries, who now did make many more demands than they dared to prior to the 19th century. And so we will share with you now a story that's known in Chinese history as the Boxer Rebellion. It's known in Chinese history as cutting of the Chinese melon. And it's also known in Chinese history as the Chinese being pushed to the wall, and therefore they will fight back. I would like to urge that as you come to this period of history, you might want to really focus in on what are the main issues we need to deal with. Who's involved in this struggle in the late 19th century? What was China's role in this struggle? Did she cause it? Did the West also play a role in causing this conflict, known as the Boxer Rebellion? Or were the Chinese at fault partly, and were the Westerners partly at fault? I'd like to begin this way, that about the year 1897, 1898, Russia was growing pretty ambitious about expanding her territory further into Manchuria, and hopefully, if she could get away with it, into Korea. Now, as you do your reading, I'd like you to probe deeply into your reading and try to delineate how much power Japan had in Korea. China had pulled out by now in Korea, and therefore China no longer plays a part in a dominant role. So the major voice in Korea now, by the close of the 19th century, will be Japan. But the role that China used to play will be sought after by the Tsarist government. So we need to understand that Russia now will play the game of testing how far the Japanese will allow her to expand into Korean waters, which the Japanese feel they should control. And as far as China is concerned, several other countries, Germany, France, and Britain, will also be attempting to move into what we call spheres of influence. This is a fun part of Chinese history to study, and yet for me, a very agonizing story to tell. And I suppose for a Chinese person listening, it's an agonizing story to hear about what their country have had to suffer through the years. So when you hear the communist government sometimes accuse the West of being imperialist about their actions in China, they have a legitimate right to call Westerners by that name. I think what would offend the Westerners is that the Chinese would continue to call them by that name during the years when the West was no longer following an imperialist policy. That's the difference that we should bear in mind. Now, by the late 19th century then, focusing particularly into the last few years of the 19th century, a tiny period of Chinese history is full of sorrow and tragedy. That particular period is when various countries, Russia starting the ball rolling, France following very quickly, Germany following very quickly, and Britain joining in the act, and so Japan joins them too, seeking bits and pieces of Chinese territory as their own real estate and calling these areas their spheres of influence. You notice the term spheres of influence. Now, how does one claim this and allow the Chinese to still call itself an independent kingdom? Primarily because there was a fear by one of the countries who didn't get into the act of claiming a sphere of influence, thinking of an idea that really was generated by another country who had already claimed a sphere of influence. But this young country, having just established herself from the east coast to the west coast of a continent, having built railroads, having conquered the West, having tamed the native peoples of the continent into which the early settlers had come, this young republic now wanted a share of the pie. And that particular pie, in these last few years of the 19th century, that was having a lot of trouble. The pie was China. The country we were describing earlier was the United States. We're talking about a policy that was introduced that plays a part in American diplomatic history as well as Chinese diplomatic history. We call it the open door policy. Open door? Whose door are we opening? What is the secret agenda behind that open door policy? I think if you sort of play a game with yourself with this information that you will be reading, and we will be talking about more as the course develops, you will find that it is quite interesting to find that Germany has claimed some very valuable piece of real estate along the Shantung area. Britain has claimed the whole valley, equivalent to the Mississippi Valley. In China, it's known as the Yangtze Valley. we find France's claim two of the southern provinces of China close to Indochina as her sphere of influence. And the Russians, the Tsarist Russians, have claimed a piece of real estate that the Japanese had wanted to claim after the First Sino-Japanese War, and this is the Liaotang Peninsula. So therefore, the Japanese decide if the Westerners are going to have a piece of the real estate of China, well, they would like to have some area also, and this land, of course, is the land opposite to Taiwan, known as the Fujian province. So in the spheres of influence, everyone had a piece of the pie: the French, the Germans, the British, the Japanese, the Russians. No Americans. Why not? And you might want to ask yourself, the reason is getting very busy over the Spanish-American Wars. The United States was much too busy in 1898, but by the close of that year, the Spanish having been defeated, the Americans also had Cuba, and therefore they could turn their attention to East Asia, having just claimed a new piece of real estate in Southeast Asia known as the Philippine Islands. And so what we are seeing here is that the Americans become concerned to have also some real estate in China as a sphere of influence. There's no more land, and therefore what do? You introduce a policy saying that all those who have already claimed some territory in China should permit the open door for any other country that wants to trade in that particular zone. Well, the Japanese thought this was funny, the Russians thought, well, what is the United States after? But each of them said, well, okay. And the reason that Americans were so concerned is that that piece of real estate that was listed, quote unquote, as a sphere of influence could become a colony, as most of Southeast Asian nations had become by the close of the 19th century. Literally, we're talking about the possibility that China would be torn apart if the spheres of influence became colonies of these various countries that I've just listed. Therefore, we have the open door policy instituted. The countries reluctantly agreed, so they all had to sign this. And who was saved from eventual colonization as a result? We now have the Chinese being saved. Now, the Chinese felt that this was really a great act on the part of the American government. Some of them, of course, knew better than that. But on the whole, it looked as though in time of need, the United States was coming through as a country interested in China's welfare. And therefore, we find that the open door policy implemented at the turn of the 20th century, around 1900, 1901, will result in the saving of China from destruction and partition among both Westerners and one Asian country, and that is Japan. I'd like to pause here for a moment, again dividing up my series of lectures into segments in order that you might be able to do some discussion, and in order that I can move you into a new area of focusing and studying during my absence for the next few lectures. I would like to urge that you be aware of a traumatic event in Chinese history known as the Boxer Rebellion. Read about it, try to understand why the Boxer Rebellion occurred, try to understand why the Westerners eventually succeeded, and try to understand also why the Manchu government will eventually fall, and many people will feel that it was the Boxer Rebellion that was the last cry from the Manchu government in terms of rebellion and action that they might support against further Western encroachment into their empire. A sad story, but a true story. I'd like now to move into looking at how this traditional society of China and the Boxer Rebellion moving within this traditional society was able to challenge the West for a few months, shake up the West in a way it never had been shaken before, and eventually shaking the Manchu government up in a way from which we find that the dynasty will never recover. And out of this sorrow, this is China's sorrow really, out of this sorrow will emerge the remnants of a group of people, an educated elite, who will say, we've had enough, the Manchu government cannot really protect us, and therefore we will need to get rid of the Manchus and put in its place a government that will have decision-making powers shared by more people, an educated elite, educated not only in the Chinese classics, but also in Western traditions of political theory and political science and economics. We now have seen, as you've listened to some of my lectures, that the China ports have been opened. We've had some wars and conflicts. We've also seen that there is a new component, a religious group, moving into the Chinese scene. So the Confucian order, which had all the supporters from China obeying and doing what the Confucian teachings were all about, the Confucian teachings are now being questioned by a very small group of people. They are the Christians. And we also have the modernization process, which will bring a lot of Westerners into China. And these Westerners will want to build railroads, they will want to build roads. In other words, develop within China an infrastructure that will help them take resources out to the ports and home to the countries where they came from. These are your early multinational companies, which are permitted to come to China to own real estate, to build railroads, to develop the mines, and to take home the finished product. Now, the Boxer Rebellion was an attempt by a group of peasants initially to show that they disapproved of all the new ways that were moving into the villages. For example, railroads being cut through cemeteries, that their ancestors' spirits were being disturbed. This bothered them. Also, some Chinese people were disturbed, those who were not converts, that the Chinese Christians no longer paid some dues in order to keep the cemeteries going. They thought they were Christians now. They no longer had to support the Chinese cemetery. The Christians had their own cemeteries. This didn't sit too well. We also have lots of little irksome things that begin to occur. For example, we have the Chinese Christians living a little more comfortably than the Chinese peasant Christian. And if the Chinese peasant Christian got into trouble with the law, the missionaries, being the ombudsman, trying to help that Christian peasant, even if that Christian peasant were in the wrong. I hope you understand what I'm trying to say here. That there were some needless irritations being developed in the interpersonal relations that go on day to day in a Chinese village. And so, one day, a group of young Chinese men who performed a set of exercises like boxing began to secretly plan to get rid of the foreigners, particularly the Christians, in that particular area. The area in which they lived was in the Shantung Peninsula, close to Peking, and in the initial phases of the Boxer Rebellion, it's important to remember that the Boxer Rebellion was anti-Christian as well as anti-Manchu and anti-foreign, against all foreigners. And the Manchu was a foreigner, so it was also anti-Manchu. Now, in the midst of this story of the Boxer Rebellion, and I would sort of hope that you would read about it as a story form, because it has many components. As you look at it as a story form, you'll find that the Boxer Rebellion initially was against the Manchus, but in moving toward the capital city of Peking, the ruler in Peking was not a man, but a woman. A very powerful elder statesman of a person in the name of Dowager Empress Cixi. She arose from the ranks as a concubine, therefore she wasn't way up high in the level of birth, ranks. She was a beautiful person as a child, as a young adult, and later on had enough of clever relationships with men in the court, and particularly with the young prince who eventually became emperor. And thus a woman became Empress of China. This Empress Dowager was not too friendly to the West. She was anti-foreign in her attitude, a tragedy compared to Japan, who had an emperor who was friendly to the West. So when you're trying to compare China and Japan, I think it's very important that you keep in mind that two countries, both having monarchies at the same time, late 19th century, early 20th, but both dealing with their monarchies in different ways, and the monarchies having a strategy which was quite different. Looking at the Manchus, this Empress Cixi decided that she really didn't want to modernize at the accelerated pace that the Japanese were modernizing. She didn't try to understand as much as she should of Western technology. And so although China had budgeted for modernization in terms of funds, those funds were quite limited compared to the Japanese. And let's move now to this conflict in which the Manchu Empress was involved. As the Boxer rebels moved toward the capital, that means they might attack her, she turns around and supports them. So one component of the Manchu rebels, the anti-Manchu, naturally was thrown by the wayside. If the empress is going to provide you with arms to attack the foreigner, you utilize that help. But because after all, the peasants don't have an abundance of money, they have limited means. And so what I'm trying to say is this, that we need to focus in on some of the reasons why the Manchu empress would help the Boxers, why the Boxer rebels would accept that help, and why the Boxers were against the foreigners in the first place. Going back to traditional feelings of anxiety against these railroads that were coming in to disturb the peace of the ancestors and their ancestors' spirit. We need to move in this particular time frame very fast, because in a few months some horrible events occurred. People died. Even one death is too many if it's caused in a fit of anger and the person is an innocent victim. Christians were killed. Christians who were both Japanese, who were Chinese, who were Korean, and who were American and German and British. So we're talking about Christians being killed, whoever they were, whatever their nationality. And this is important. And when we write history from the Western viewpoint and talk about persecution of Christians, we often forget to put in our textbooks that the Christians were not merely white Christians or Western Christians. The Christians were also Asian Christians. This has tended to be left out. So we need to correct our history book. In addition to Christians, we have innocent victims being imprisoned in the different diplomatic legations in Peking. The empress fled the city when she felt it was getting out of control when the Boxers came in, although she provided them with arms. And what we have is that a group of all the delegations decided, rather than defend each delegation separately, they might go under if they did that, to try to group their resources together and perhaps protect themselves if they could all remain in one large area and pool together both their food as well as their arms and freshwater supply. And so for several weeks, the diplomatic legations in Peking were imprisoned by the Boxer rebels till people in England and people in France and people in Germany and some in America thought that their loved ones had been murdered by the Boxers, and some in England had even divvied up the inheritance left by those who had left a will back home in England or in France or in America. Unknown to them, Chinese were helping Westerners, helping them with food, fresh water, and protection from the Boxers. And we do not have a massacre of all the diplomatic legations, but the killing of a few people. But this was made out to be many more from the legation than it actually was. True, someone from the German embassy was killed, but he challenged the Chinese army, and in this challenge he lost his life. Now, the rescue of these diplomatic members is a story that has been portrayed in books and also on the movie screen in Hollywood. I've had a chance to watch it, and watching it as a student and watching it as a professor teaching this area, I'm seeing the story in different lights. In a different light in the sense that the movie tends to portray the Chinese as evil, the Westerners as the saviors, protecting all these legation people who are innocent victims, and that nothing that the Chinese do are good things at all. And that's the image that Hollywood can portray when the story is misused. It's true the Boxers caused a lot of heartache, but it's also true that many Chinese helped Westerners during the siege, and it's even been suspected that the help for fresh water, fresh food, came from quarters of very high Chinese official levels who didn't want the foreigners hurt. The empress had fled the city, but those officials had remained behind. So as you read the details of the Boxer Rebellion, would you remember that this was a traumatic event in Chinese history? And let's see how the West will punish the Chinese for challenging the Western security of the diplomatic legation area, because that's supposed to be sacred area. That's like having a foreign country challenge the territory of a foreign country if you move in and challenge the embassy area. And so what we find is that the foreigners are going to punish the Chinese Manchu government. But in trying to decide amongst themselves how the Manchus should be punished, the foreigners couldn't agree. And I remember reading as a graduate student this very interesting kind of confusion that kept going on in the discussion. Should we get rid of the Manchus? Should we bring in another dynasty to rule China? If you do get rid of the Manchus, who are you going to bring in? Because we've gotten all these privileges from the Manchu government. Will this next group of people give us the same kind of opportunities? That's a gamble. And so in the end, the foreigners decided, we'll go with the Manchu dynasty, we'll bring back the empress, but we'll also insist that the empress now toe the line and abide by some of the requests and the demands that we foreigners will make for giving us all this trouble and for causing the death of some of the members of our community. The very severe punishment that the foreigners levied on the Manchu dynasty is known as the Boxer Protocol. And I'd like you to look at some of the components of the Boxer Protocol. There are several. You might want to look at the amount of compensation levied. You might want to look at the demands made on the Manchu government to reform and modernize. And also you might want to look at several other kinds of demands, such as real estate, privileges, trade, and the demanding of not only money, but seeing to it that the duties, the custom duties, the revenue income of the Manchu government was tied into the payment of the amount of money requested by the foreigners. I think a wonderful story to this sad period in Chinese history shows the close relationship built between the Chinese and the Americans. The Americans are always loved by the Chinese. We need to remember that. And perhaps this story, more than any other, will illustrate that the action taken by the American government endeared themselves to the Chinese amongst those who heard the story. Of course, we need to know that not everybody hears stories about the good things that one country might do for another. The story was this, that when America found that she had overcharged in terms of requesting money, we call this indemnity, for the cost of the rebellion, the Boxer Rebellion, for those who might have died, a few missionaries had died, for the cost of property loss, America felt that China had paid over and above what was needed for her to pay. And so instead of returning to the Chinese government all the excess money that had been requested of her, the United States asked that this amount of money be put aside, that the American government did not want it, but this amount of money be put aside and be used for scholarships in order that Chinese students could go to America to study, and Americans could in turn also someday, in smaller numbers, come to China to learn the Chinese language. So the basis of this relationship was laid. And amongst those who benefited from these were institutions like Harvard University, Yale University, and Princeton University. I hope as you hear this story, you will be anxious to read further in your materials, and you will be anxious to also understand the Chinese viewpoint, the American viewpoint, the Japanese, the German viewpoint, particularly why they were so angry, and the French and Russian viewpoint. It's a traumatic period of Chinese history. I'd like to now take up another issue and share with you a period of history at the turn of the 20th century. At the turn of the 20th century, after the Boxer Rebellion, the Manchu government decides that it better get its acts in order and it better move toward modernization, because if it didn't, then it might be too late. But unknown to the Manchu rulers, it was already too late. The process of secret societies planning to overthrow the government had begun. You recall that I mentioned Dr. Sun Yat-sen, and if you recall, I've mentioned the Chinese Revolution of 1911. What you have now is a period of history where between 1903 and 1911, the underground rebellious movement is accelerated. Young people, middle-aged people are becoming involved secretly, because if you're caught, you can be beheaded, secretly planning the overthrow of the Manchu government. To make a long story short, the rebellion is successful. And the success emerges into the limelight, into the newspapers of all the different countries in the world in October 1911. When the world finds out that it didn't take the foreigner to bring the downfall of the Manchu government, it took the Chinese people themselves to overthrow the last dynasty of China's history.